Well, good morning. Today we're going to start our annual forage webinar series. And we're going to talk today about just an overview of annual forage systems and really just walk through the various options and combinations, and which are pretty much endless, but to give you some ideas of how things might fit together. And then in the subsequent webinars that we're going to have for the next month, we're going to get into the specifics about the various species and classes of annual forages and how to manage them to achieve the best results. So today's a big picture overview, and then we'll get into more details in our subsequent webinars. So to get started, I wanted to start with kind of the core tips that I always give people when we're thinking about using annual forages. And the first one is that there are a lot of different annuals that you can plant. But if you're looking for forage, and that is a major goal, you want to make sure that you have grass as a high component of what you plant, because it is king when it comes to biomass production. So when we think about forage production, grass will always outcompete things like forbs, for instance. That's not saying you can't plant other things for other goals. Just make sure that if this is a major goal, that you don't skimp too much on the grass. And then as we think about what to plant, you really need to think about when you're planting. And so you need to select the right class of forage for the planting time and the time at which you're really looking for forage. And so we're going to really spend most of our time today talking about that. What are the different classes? When would you plant them, and when would they be available for grazing? And then the last thing, which again, we're going to dive much more deeply into in our future sessions. But as we think about managing annuals, annuals are very, very fast growing, and they're quite different from perennials. And so one of the key things to think about especially as a nutritionist, is that we want to keep it immature. And so quick rotation during the growing season will actually extend the growing season, because if you keep it immature, you'll get better regrowth, and thus you'll get more productivity. Now, there are caveats to that. And one of those is in limited water situations where you may not get much regrowth potential. And if you have limited regrowth potential because of something like that, then thinking about allowing it to accumulate more biomass and strip grazing it may be the way to go. Likewise, if you're going to be grazing during the dormant season, so let's say I plant in July some warm season annuals, and then I use them in the late fall. Well, you've got most of the growth you're going to get out of those species. And so now it's about actually maximizing the use of the growth that you have. And strip grazing can be a great way to do that. And so when we think about strip grazing, we can really get between 50 and even 100% increase in the amount of grazing that you can achieve relative to continuous or set stock grazing. And so while it does have a little bit of an increase in labor, it can be huge in terms of the amount of grazing, and thus the amount of forage that you actually get out of your annuals. And so I'm not a huge fan of strip grazing when it's during the growing season, if I have a lot of potential for regrowth. So like in eastern Nebraska where water's not limiting, or even in situations where we have irrigation and you have, a long growing season ahead of you, going ahead and doing rotational grazing instead, so you can keep it vegetative rather than letting it get more mature in a strip grazing situation, might be the way to go. But of course, it depends on your situation, what's going to be best for you. Okay, so let's talk about the classes of annuals. So I break them up into three categories. We have the warm season annual forages, and we have cool season annual forages. And within the cool season, I break them up into two different categories, either winter sensitive, like oats, Basically, that means they're going to winter kill. They won't overwinter, and winter hardy, which are something like thinking about rye or winter wheat or even winter triticale. They will overwinter, and if you plant them in the fall, you graze them in the spring, right? So our warm season summer annuals, I think most people are familiar with sorghum Sudan. They can produce a lot of biomass, typically with very little water, to be honest. Warm seasons are quite good at growing with a very small amount of water, which is awesome. They can also be quite high quality if you keep them immature, or they can be very low quality. I think all annuals fit into that. And it may be even more extreme than what you're used to with perennials because they grow so fast. So management's going to be key. But as we think about these species, I have these three categories and I have 4 planting time periods. So the way I look at this is I've broken it up into thinking about the time period of in the year when I might plant, and then what I would suggest to plant based off of that time period. So in early spring here, March to May, you might plant a winter sensitive cool season like oats. Now, one of the things that most people ask me about when it comes to oats is they want to plant them in March so they can get early spring grazing like before their cool season perennial forage is available, like say something like brome. And the problem is that it really takes about 45 to 60 days from planting to when those plants are going to be available for grazing. So even if I plant March 15th, it's not going to be ready until May. And so this can fill, these winter sensitive cool seasons like oats can fill the gap in May to July, but they're not going to give you the really early grazing. If you're really looking for early grazing, then we need to skip down to this last class, which is the winter hardy cool season species. And we're going to plant them in the fall, so September up to about November. And that's something like cereal rye. And these species can give you early spring grazing, like even as early as April 1. This year, we were able to get out on our rye on April 1. We planted in October, about early October, and we had a nice mild winter, and so we were able to get out there and start grazing. But I will say that the later you plant, the later you're likely going to be able to get out and graze, because you do see after about September 15th a reduction in the amount of spring growth, and thus you're going to see a delay to get to the amount of grazing biomass you have. Now, going back up here to thinking about planting dates in the spring, after about May 15th, you might start thinking about warm season summer annuals, like the Sudan grasses, for instance. And I will tell you that you're really looking for the temperatures, the soil temperatures to be 65. That would kind of be the goal. So usually, for most of Nebraska, that probably is late May. But you can graze those about 45 days after planting. So July 1st through the summer, if you're looking at the grazing season, or if you're planting them late, like say this August 1st date that I have, that might be like you're planting after wheat, for instance. That likely means that you're going to allow the growth, whatever growth you get, to grow in the late summer period, and then you're going to be grazing it in the winter. And so it's probably some stockpiled forage at that point. And then we have this winter sensitive cool season species. Now these have a very short window, August 1st to September 1st. I will tell you September 1st is probably a drop dead date in that we get very little growth after that point, and you're better off switching to winter hardy and getting some spring grazing. But these winter sensitive cool season species, when they're planted in the late summer, will be very high quality. So oats in that are late summer planted, so grazing them in the fall, they're going to be very different than when you plant them in the spring. They do not produce as much of the lignin, which means they just are very high quality, very highly digestible. And so you can plant these, and we have grazed cows in peak lactation, and they'll maintain condition. We have bred them out there. They do very well on this stuff. Or we might be using it for, say, growing calves, weaning them in October and even November, and then grazing into the early winter on this and getting 2 pound a day gain. So this stuff is very high quality and can be used in this limited window, if that makes sense. The other thing I want to point out is I kind of have transitioned from warm season to this cool season on August 1st. And I'll tell you that date is a little more stretchy. Darren and I had done some work here in Lincoln looking at planting these various species and looking at how much growth we got, really looking at from July 15th to about August 15th. And really what we saw is that depending on the year, sometimes the warm seasons really did very well even into August 15th. And it depended on, of course, the fall or that late summer period and how warm it was. And the quality when we planted late really wasn't that much worse than the cool season. So one of the things you might consider kind of in that time frame, you know, this early August to mid-August timeframe, is you might put a mix in, for instance, of some warm seasons, some cool seasons, depending on how the weather is. One might do better than the other, and you can kind of hedge your bets a little bit. So I wanted to talk just a minute about this guide. So we have a planting annual forages guide that Jerry and I put together, you know, some years ago. But it is quite useful in that it provides you with kind of, here's the time frame for planting. So fall, spring, late spring, early summer, and then late summer time frame. And then it also gives you like suggestion for seeding rates, seeding depth, of course, the planting date here, and then it gives you a grazing value. And this grazing value is a combination of yield potential, nutritive value, and palatability. And so if you're looking for more information about what to plant and when, this guide can be quite useful for that. Okay, so now I wanted to spend a few minutes and talk about some of the individual classes and just kind of give you a picture of what they look like. So the first class we're talking about is these winter hardy species like cereal rye, winter wheat, winter triticale. And then really there's not a lot of really great overwintering legumes. Hairy vetch is one that will overwinter quite consistently in Nebraska. Unfortunately, it can produce a toxin that can make cattle photosensitive and can actually cause them to have ulcers on their skin. However, I will point out that we tend not to see it be a problem when it's immature and in a very low proportion of the forage. So if you do put it in, you just want to make sure that you are managing grazing to keep everything very vegetative and not allow it to get mature. It is a bit of a risk, and so I personally usually don't put it in, and I usually just stick with a small cereal. And in particular, I like cereal rye, mostly because it tends to come on so a little bit earlier in the spring. And in fact, if you're looking for early spring grazing, Elbon rye comes out of dormancy a bit earlier than some of the northern type rye, which a lot of our VNS rye are. And so I do like Elbon rye for that. And we can get very good performance. Again, it's all about managing maturity, which means having the right stocking rates. So what we're really talking about, planting September, October, and grazing in April, May, and even into late June. I typically get, you know, about 60 days of grazing on these, and I will start out, you know, when it's something like 5 inches tall. And we're going to talk a lot more about management of these in our future sessions. But stocking rates, we're really looking at half a cow to 1 cow an acre. Earlier, you don't have as much growth, and so you have a little bit lower stocking rates. Later, you can increase your stocking rates, and we can get about 1.5 to 2 AUMs an acre off of these typically. Our early spring planting, so something that's like oats or spring triticale. Remember, these are planting really in March, early April for May, June, July grazing. They're very similar in terms of management and stocking rates to our winter hardy species. We're really looking at, probably a cow an acre, and we're looking at getting really 1.5 to even 3 AUMs an acre, depending on where you're at and how much moisture you have and how warm it gets, how quickly. Can you plant other things? Yes, like this is a time period, this early period where you could plant some brassicas or something like spring field peas. Again, they don't produce as much biomass as the grasses, so make sure we have plenty of grass in the mix. And oats will, and spring barley, they'll produce more biomass than something like annual ryegrass will. Okay, winter hardy species, or excuse me, warm season species like sorghum sudan or sudan grass, which is my favorite, which is what we're going to talk about in our next session, is really planting in this kind of late May period and looking at grazing in the summer. So this is a great fill-in if you are cool season dominated, like in eastern Nebraska. Grazing during this period can get you off of, say, your smooth brome pastures and can allow you to have more grazing in the early spring and late fall on those cool seasons, if that makes sense. The other option for these species is to plant them a little bit later, say like after you've had your cool season species that you've been grazing, whether that be rye or say something like oats. Let's say if I was planting and grazing oats here, I could come back in after they're done and plant these warm season. And then you're really not going to get a lot of growth to do grazing during the growing season, but you can stockpile that and graze that in the fall and have forage, maybe before corn stalks are ready or instead of corn stalks if you don't have corn stalks. Late summer planting, again, this is that August time period. Oats, and my particular favorite right now is rapeseed. It produces a lot of leaf. It's relatively cheap. It is high in energy. It is high in protein. We do get a little performance boost out of it relative to just oats alone, and it actually cheapens up the mix. But that's really looking at planting it here in August and grazing in the fall, October, November. We have grazed into February on it. It looks horrible after winter kills, but the quality is still there. So looks can be deceiving. This can be some really great feed. And usually we'll get about 1.5 to 2 AUMs an acre off of this. I will tell you that with strip grazing on these, we've been able to extend that up to about 3 AUMs an acre. And during this time period, if you plant in early August, you get, of course, more growth than in late August. And so you get a few more AUMs out of it. Okay, I wanted to show you another document that can be quite helpful. And this is Planting Annual Forage Systems. This was a document that Jerry and I put together, again, quite a while ago, but it kind of works through these classes of species that we were just talking about, some general management ideas, but it also walks through, which I think is helpful, kind of systems and how you might string together these annual forage chains, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But it also gives you some ideas of how you might calculate your carrying capacity and stocking rates for these various forages really depending on what types of yields you might have been getting from hay in your area. So even if you haven't planted these before, you could probably talk to your local educator and ask them about expectations in your region, given your situation, to give you some ideas of carrying capacity. And then we can show you here how to calculate how many acres you would need based off of the number of animals and the expected AUMs that you could get. So this is quite useful a document just to get you thinking about what the possibilities are. And then we did do some cost of forage production. Now, again, this is a bit dated, but what I think is useful about it is that it gives you some guidance of how you might think about calculating it for yourself using your own numbers. Okay, with that, let's talk about a few annual forage system options. So this first one here, I kind of have 3 fields. One field was, a field that we were in corn. And so we're using it for corn residue in the winter. I know we're probably going to be in a dry lot here in March. People don't like their cattle out on stalks in March. I will tell you that it's not causing compaction like people think, but that's for another day. So in this particular system, let's look at field 2 here. We have planted rye in September, and then we have come in and we're grazing it in April and May. And then we are going to plant a warm season like Sudan grass. It's going to grow for 45 days or so, and then we're going to start grazing it in the summer. But we have some gaps, right? So during the time that the warm season is growing, here in June and late May, we're missing some grazing. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in field 3 here. We're going to plant a cool season like oats. We're going to graze those oats in late May through June. And then when we switch over to this warm season, we're going to go ahead and plant. In this case, I have a cool season in August that we're going to then graze in the early fall here. Now you could plant in early July here, a warm season, and graze that kind of in this late fall as well. So you have many, many options. We could get even more complex if we wanted to. Let's say, I have this hay feeding period here in March. Well, we need to fill that. So we have another field down here that we plant to a cool season like oats. We cut it for hay to fill in our March period. And then we plant our warm season that we're going to graze in December, January, February, when, let's say if you didn't have corn residue, for instance. So again, combinations, you can go a lot of different ways, but this is just kind of giving you some ideas of how to string things together to fit your needs. Or you can use annuals and fill in for perennials, for instance. And this is actually a system that we're using right now with some of our cows. And that is, we are doing the rye grazing in the spring, followed by Sudan grazing in the summer. And in between, instead of planting another annual, that's where we're using our brome grass. So in May and June, we're using brome grass with the cows. And then in September and October, we come back to brome grass after we get off our warm season annual. And then we go to corn residue, graze corn residue, and then feed hay here in March. So a lot of different options depending on your situations and a lot of different ways to do this. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to join. And we're going to have a session next week on Sudan grass, actually. So we're going to talk a lot about managing your warm season annuals during the growing season. And then the next session is actually going to talk about species selection for various uses of those warm seasons. So, our annual forages, we can also produce silage or hay. or maybe you want to stockpile the forage. So there's a lot of different varieties and a lot of different types when it comes to some of the warm seasons, like sorghum Sudan. We have photoperiod sensitive, we have metal sterile, we have dry stock. We have a lot of different traits, BMR. And so we're going to talk about some of those and then discuss when you might want to be using them. So feel free to join us on Thursday when we're going to talk about grazing of warm season annuals.